It's Sunday, September 7, 2025. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minutenews. Our guest today is a best-selling author, tech and security expert, and former DHS Chief of Staff who penned the anonymous 2018 New York Times op-ed, "I am part of the resistance inside the Trump administration." He's since written several books, including Blowback, a warning to save democracy from the next Trump. Miles Taylor, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Anthony, it's great to be with you.
Miles, since we last spoke just over a year ago, all of your warnings about a second Trump administration seem to have materialized. Is this version of Trump more dangerous than even you had feared?
I think it's pretty close to what I had feared. And to be more specific, I think something like 80% of the predictions that I made in my book, Blowback, have now come true. And, you know, the subtitle of that book was A Warning to Save Democracy from Trump's Revenge. And as you and I talked about, I mean, honestly, what I set out to do was I didn't feel like anyone had yet painted a comprehensive portrait of what a second Trump administration could look like, and more specifically, how it would be totally focused on revenge. And this is before Donald Trump said, "I am your retribution." But it was evident to me from the first Trump administration that that's what a second term was going to be all about. And I don't just mean revenge against people like me who'd been critics of the president, but revenge against entire departments and agencies and sectors of society that I was pretty convinced he would go after. And I spoke to more than 100 of my former colleagues in the Trump administration, from the cabinet level down to, you know, the staff assistants that sat outside the Oval Office, to try to paint that picture. And I think it's been pretty close to accurate. What I will say has surprised me has been the speed. I think they've been able to move faster than I would have expected. I wouldn't have thought they would have gotten to 80% of my predictions for his revenge agenda by 7 months in, but they have. And I think what the American people need to understand is there is no sign of this moderating. It does not moderate. It doesn't get less dramatic from this point on. It gets more dramatic. And I'll tell you, to give you a window to focus on, Stephen Miller had said to me before I left the Trump administration that in a second term, when they would do a shock and awe blitz, those were his words that I've been repeating for years. He said it's going to be a shock and awe blitz of executive orders. His goal was to try to get as many of the most controversial policies as possible on the table as soon as possible and run them all up to the Supreme Court by the Supreme Court's second term during the Trump administration. So that would be next June. The Supreme Court will drop its final decisions of its term. This is the window where they want to do their most extreme things that they can, is between now and next June, to try to make sure they can run them up to the high court and get a determination that they hope will be in their favor.
When we talk about they, how much of it is Stephen Miller and how much of it is Donald Trump? Because as I see it, there are two tracks here. Trump is into this kind of Gulf of America rebranding and stupid, trivial things that make him feel a little bit better about himself. But really the kind of far-right nationalist racist stuff is coming from the likes of Stephen Miller, Russell Vogt. I mean, who's really running the show?
Well, look, Trump really does run the show because these guys are willing to contort themselves into political pretzel knots to try to justify the stupidest things he says, right? So Stephen and Russ and those folks will try to put a semi-intellectual spin on even the dumbest pronouncements that come out of Donald Trump's mouth. So I think that shows you that at the end of the day, the buck does really stop with him. But that said, there are very intensive ideologues around Donald Trump who have a years well-formed nativist ideology, an anti-international ideology that they have been very eager to pursue. And a lot of people in that ecosystem who've taken advantage of the Trump administration to advance their own agenda. And, occasionally these things actually conflict with what Donald Trump wants. And every now and then you see those things, rise above the fore. I mean, Stephen Miller would like to deport every single immigrant in the United States But you saw this with Donald Trump getting lobbied by the farm lobby. He said, I don't know, my farmer friends don't really want people deported. And he added some sort of conditions on the deportation plan, which I'm sure were infuriating to Stephen Miller. But look, at the end of the day, I mean, I think that's one of the alarming things, though, is if everyone around Donald Trump was as obviously stupid as Donald Trump is, he wouldn't be able to execute his agenda. But because he does have intelligent but very bad-meaning people around him, they've been able to systematize a lot of the things that he wanted to do in the first Trump administration, but which he was told were illegal or unconstitutional.
And we've seen this when he is handed executive orders and someone has to read them to him, not least because there's been at least 1,000 of them so far. But he has read them and he looks as if he doesn't really know what they are, what they mean, or it's jogging his memory, or he just has some vague idea. He just loves the penmanship. However, on April 9th, you became the star attraction of one of these executive orders, which was entitled Addressing Risks Associated with an Egregious Leaker and Disseminator of Falsehoods. He revoked your security clearance. He claimed you'd abandoned your sacred oath by disclosing sensitive information. He accused you of potentially committing treason and then ordered those agencies to investigate you. Just explain for us how that feels for somebody who was a committed public servant and a former Republican to be on the receiving end of this.
Well, in part, Anthony, my wife and I had expected this would happen at some point. You don't write a whole book about a second term of a vengeful president and not expect that he's going to come after you. And so, I think that we had long suspected that at some point we would be on one of these lists, and that the president would do something like revoke my security clearance. What was jarring to me on April 9th is I got a text message from a friend who said, the president's talking about you in the Oval Office right now. You need to tune in. And I watched it live, and exactly what you said has been happened is he had an assistant next to him describing to the president what was in this executive order, and then Trump sort of freestyled.
Yeah, and he said he'd never heard of you, right?
Yeah, that's right. He's never heard of me before. We've never met.
Yeah.
As the aide is describing to him what is in the order, you can almost see Trump's glee, because something very different happened in that order compared to all the revenge orders he'd signed before that. This order was the first time in American history that a president has directed a federal investigation into one of his critics by name. That's never happened in an executive order in American history, as I later found out from a number of judicial scholars. And he followed it with another order against one of my former colleagues, Chris Krebs, who, of course, committed the crime of saying that the 2020 election was secure when the president wanted him to declare that it was not secure, falsely. But that's what was shocking to me, Anthony, is I didn't think that early in the administration he was personally going to start directing investigations into his critics. And more ridiculous than that was the fact that the president effectively declared what crime he had found me guilty of, and then with the order directed his staff to go find the evidence of that crime. So think of this as a full inversion of how the justice system works. He declares me guilty of treason, a crime that's punishable by death in the United States. He effectively accuses me of being a spy. And then he says in the order, well, okay, go find the evidence that this is true. Were it not for how comical the Orwellian title is, I would have tried to mock the nature of this order. But if you read the order word for word, it reads like a farce. It reads almost satirical. But at the end of the day, it's not funny, because you don't have to care about Miles Taylor. You just need to care about the fact that the president proved on April 9th that with the stroke of a pen, he can order a federal investigation into anyone. And he sort of jumped that firewall we've had between the White House and the Justice Department to keep a president from personally directing investigations. He jumped right over that. And now, frankly, there's not a single soul in the United States of America that's safe from that if Donald Trump decides he's got the time to stroke his pen off, across a piece of paper and direct an investigation. That is not what we want a president of any party in this country to be able to do. And I ultimately think that, the courts will find that action, among others, was very blatantly unconstitutional, but that's going to take some time.
There are people that can stop all of this madness. And really I'm talking to the Republicans in Congress. I mean, that they have the ability to take control of this situation, and yet they are done. And I mentioned you're a former Republican. I note in 2022 you tweeted, "I'm done. I no longer believe the Republican Party can be saved. The vitriolic rhetoric is inspiring violent radicals. I'm quitting the GOP, and I hope more do the same." Why are more not doing the same? I mean, after January 6, for most of us who naively believed that there was no chance that Donald Trump could get re-elected, he got re-elected. I mean, this is what is so frightening about all of this, is that the extremes, the behavior, the insanity, and still people, including people in Congress, are staying with him.
They are. Look, I'll say from a voter's perspective, I think there are a lot of Americans who are Republicans who've sort of quiet quit the party, that aren't out there touting the fact that they're in the GOP because they're not excited to be in a MAGA GOP. So I think there is a really sizable number, probably millions of Americans who have quiet quit the Republican Party. That is a very important voting segment. I mean, as you and I have talked about before, in 2020, that voting segment was pivotal in making Joe Biden president of the United States. Republicans who voted Democrat for the first time in their lives were one of the most important voting blocs that put Joe Biden in the White House. Unfortunately, Americans, all people, have very short memories. And after 4 years, it was evident in the polling that even some of those people had either gone back to the tribe and were willing to vote for Donald Trump again, or didn't have any interest in voting in the election and sat it out. And we saw that in the outcome, is there were far fewer Republicans that sort of switched tickets in 2024 than in 2020. And, that was one of the factors in Donald Trump winning re-election, is people had sort of forgotten. But you don't need to think about the sort of ambiguous idea of the masses forgetting. There's some really incredible examples that we can point to, Anthony, is, business leaders who had been so incredibly opposed to Donald Trump, who started singing an optimistic tone about a second Trump administration. The Jamie Dimons of the world at Chase and others who said, well, no, he could be great for the economy and things could be really good. Some of those same people have now come out and said, Trump's policies, the tariffs policies, the recklessness, the pullback from international financial institutions could spell a once in a lifetime financial crisis. I mean, there have been extraordinary warnings, but these folks cannot claim that they didn't know. I mean, it was obvious Donald Trump was going to go this direction. In my very first book, A Warning About the Trump Administration, I wrote about his obsession with tariffs and his plan, if uninhibited, if he had a team that was willing to do it, that he would go slap a bunch of illegal tariffs on other countries. Now, the courts have just proven that was the case. They've said that Trump unlawfully attached tariffs to these countries. But whether you loved or hated the people in the first Trump administration who tried to keep Trump from doing things that were illegal, they did manage to keep these policies at bay. People like Steve Mnuchin at the Treasury Department did convince Donald Trump not to go on this economy-wrecking tariff spree. But that's not the folks that we have around Donald Trump this time. Even if it is illegal to use his emergency powers to levy tariffs, they don't care. They're willing to say yes to the man who wants them to do it.
But what I'm really interested in is this kind of pull, this weird pull of Republicans, both congresspeople and voters, who are prepared to put their own interests to one side just to own the libs, who, just to back a winner. And they put aside the human rights abuses, they put aside, the kidnappings and the abductions of people off the streets. I mean, I'm sure a few of them are, coming around to realizing that that's a little inappropriate. But still, paying less tax, seems to be so much more of a draw for these people, and you were amongst these people. So what is it? What am I missing here?
At the end of the day, Anthony, I really think it is the effects of tribalism. I mean, from an evolutionary biological perspective, it is one of the most powerful forces within the human species, is a tendency to cluster for protection. And that tendency overrides a lot of other interests. And we see that in our politics. Our politics have become tribal because people see that tribe as crucial to their survival. Don't take my word for it. Take the American people's word for it. I mean, just a few years ago, for the first time in the history of polling, a majority of partisans on the Republican side and the Democratic side said they viewed the opposition as a threat to their way of life, an existential threat to their way of life. The numbers have never been that high before. And so because politics is so tribal, you've got each side starting to see the other as an existential threat. I think the difference, though, with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party is there has been a willingness to follow this carnival barker over a cliff again and again and again, not just over one cliff. The guy climbs back up the mountain and says, jump with me again, even though you know that you got hurt the first time. Let's do it again. And they're willing to because they're so deeply afraid of being kicked out of the tribe. And Trump knows that as well. And he wants to play up that fear so they continue to follow him. And autocrats have done this for decades. They've done this for centuries, is try to make the alternative, getting kicked out of the tribe, look like it will be the end of your life. And how has he done that? He's done that by going after people like me. He's done that by going after the Liz Cheneys and the Adam Kinzingers, showing that their careers will be ruined, their families will be threatened, their lives will be destroyed if they veer away from the tribe. And I'm telling you, it's been incredibly successful. It's been very, very successful. The Republican Party has been fully taken over by the MAGA movement. Rational Republicans, in just a matter of years, have been completely pushed out, and there is almost zero resistance inside the party. And I will tell you, I don't think this was a foregone conclusion. 4 years ago, Anthony, a group of us got together, Adam Kinzinger and others. There was about 150 of us who got together right after Trump left office and talked about how we could swing the pendulum of the Republican Party back from the radical side to the rational side. And we spun up a whole ecosystem of different organizations and nonprofit groups and, community building and efforts to make this happen. And we failed catastrophically. It was a total failure, organization by organization. Why is that? Because that phenomenon, that tribal phenomenon, weighed much heavily in favor of Donald Trump, and he was able to take over the party that way. Now, the only way to counter it, I'll say this, is you've got to make it obvious to folks that if they defect from the tribe, there will be safety somewhere else. And so that either needs to be the open arms of a Democratic Party saying we will take Republican defectors. It needs to be the idea that folks can, even if they disagree with the Democrats, caucus with them for issues that they share common cause on. That has to be evident to folks. Otherwise, they're going to continue to seek security within their existing tribe, and we're going to see that polarization get worse.
Do these people know, do they admit to themselves that the tariffs are illegal, as you quite rightly cite, and that it's American consumers that are ultimately going to be paying for these tariffs? Do they know that by reducing the tax rates that there's very little money kind of coming into the US Treasury, and that ultimately Trump does not really have an economic plan that stands up, and that economists are saying that there will likely be a massive recession in 6 to 12 months? I mean, is that on their radar? Or is the tribalism even blocking out simple facts?
Oh, it's completely blocking out simple facts. It's leading conservatives who otherwise know better, conservatives who've spent their entire careers talking about the free market economy, to blindly follow this protectionist wherever he wants to go. That's been one of the really amazing things to witness happen. And when I wrote a warning first as anonymous, that's one of the things I wrote about in that book as a key reason I couldn't support Donald Trump and why I had left the administration, which is that he was not a conservative. He was never a conservative. If the Republican Party could be boiled down to three pillars that it was supposed to stand for, it was free minds, free markets, and free people. So human freedom and economic freedom and anti-censorship and free speech. And it was clear to me he was diametrically opposed to every single one of those things, like fundamentally. And on the issue of tariffs, that, to me, I felt like should have been a wake-up call to a Republican Party that Donald Trump took over, which in 2016 was a Republican Party that, remember, was really, really colored by the Tea Party movement and colored by libertarian ideology about the government staying out of the economy, about the government making goods and services cheaper and not more expensive. And yet Donald Trump has effectively raised taxes on the American people. He's mounted takeovers of American companies. He's now seized 10% of Intel. These are all things that if Barack Obama had done them, we would have been lighting our neckties on fire on the White House lawn as Republicans. Like, listen to these words. Me and John Boehner and Paul Ryan and all these Republicans I'd worked for in the GOP, we would have been outside the gates of the White House, just lighting our ties on fire and saying, this is the end of the United States. We can't believe Barack Obama is a socialist like this. Now that Donald Trump is doing those things, some of those same Republicans in the party at the time who would have opposed it if it was Obama, they're silent. In fact, worse than that, they're openly cheering the president on. I mean, you see some of them go on TV, people who would have never supported the idea of government takeovers of private American companies, and talking about how brave Donald Trump is and how genius Donald Trump is. It is really remarkable to me to watch people throw away their values so quickly, but they do it consciously or subconsciously out of fear. They're very, very afraid.
Well, we saw this in the cabinet meeting, didn't we, just a couple of weeks ago, where they went round the room and all of them, from Howard Lutnick down, professed their deep love for the Führer, it seemed, and they were so grateful that they had been given the job. I mean, had the Trump regime told them to say that, or is there a pressure for them to say these things? Because, that looked more fascistic than anything that we'd really seen so far.
I'm going to tell you a story, and this should answer the question. I remember the first cabinet meeting in the first Trump administration, and it was similar, but not as extreme.
Yeah.
They went around the table, and almost everyone at the table said very laudatory things about the president, praised him in a very obvious and obsequious way. And there were a couple of cabinet secretaries who didn't do that, who didn't even mention Trump's name. One of them was my boss at the time, John Kelly, who at that point was Secretary of Homeland Security, and the other was Jim Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense, 2 4-star Marine generals. And when the microphone came to them at those cabinet meetings, instead of talking about how great Donald Trump was, both of them talked about how great the women and men of their departments and agencies were. And I remember right after the cabinet meeting, I brought this up with Kelly. I said, I noticed that you struck a different tone than your colleagues. And he said, glad you noticed that. That was on purpose. That's how we should be talking to the president. Not sitting there praising the president, but sitting there and talking about the men and women that they represent in those departments and agencies and how they are doing. Fast forward to this cabinet meeting that you reference, Anthony. There wasn't a soul at that table that talked like John Kelly or Jim Mattis. All of them were there to flatter the president of the United States. And it seemed evident to anyone who was watching that they could have given a shit about the men and women in their departments and agencies they have been punishing, pursuing, retaliating against, stifling in order to serve the president and advance his agenda.
Let's talk about the lack of expertise around that table as well for these departments, because Trump seems to have purposely chosen people who are completely unqualified and inappropriate for these roles, who have no experience, but more so want to deconstruct these departments, it seems. We're seeing that with RFK Jr., the Department of Health at the moment, and the CDC. We're certainly seeing it with the Department of Education. What is the plan here? Because obviously we've read Project 2025. We know about the deconstruction of the administrative state. But And as you say, things are happening far quicker than we would have thought. But this desire to employ sycophants who are also inexperienced, I mean, are they kind of, is that a kind of mutually exclusive connection there?
Well, it's worse than I think even Project 2025 envisioned, because Donald Trump is not just deconstructing the administrative state. He is building the deep state that he railed against. So there never was a deep state, Anthony. Never existed. There was never this secret society, a cabal of people connected across departments and agencies, plotting in the shadows to thwart the president of the United States. This was an image Donald Trump created, and he used people like me when I was anonymous as supposed evidence of this. But I made very clear at the time, I've made clear since, that any of us who were inside that administration acting as a check on the president were not defying the lawful orders of the commander-in-chief. It wasn't my job to say, Mr. President, here's a thing that is legal that you want to do, but I disagree with it and I'm not going to do it. No, I mean, if that was my position, then I should have never gone into that administration. My position was, if the president wanted to do things that were illegal or unconstitutional, it was my job and my oath to tell him no. That's the resistance that I was talking about. We want that resistance in every single administration, regardless of party. We want civil servants to say no. So if that was a deep state, well, then in that case, he's right. Then there was a deep state. There were people who were willing to say no to illegal things in every department and agency in the government. Trump has tried very hard to get rid of those people. And that's the part of 2025, Project 2025, that they've implemented with alacrity. But there's another part here that's more worrisome. And I say it's Trump's desire to create his own deep state, which is they're not just eliminating those government jobs and banking the savings for the American people. They are taking those billets and positions in a lot of cases and stocking the government with people who are deemed more loyal to the president. This creates an actual deep state, because rather than just competitively and blindly hiring accomplished people to come into government, you're intentionally recruiting political people who share the president's worldview and entrenching them in long-term government jobs that will continue beyond his administration so that they can coordinate to continue implementing Donald Trump's MAGA agenda in the long term. That is an actual deep state. That to me is very scary. And I really haven't heard people talking about that since this administration started. There never was a real deep state. Donald Trump is creating it. Actually, very methodically and in a massive fashion, he's building a MAGA deep state inside of the government, and he's enabling them with the authorities that they need to be able to go break the law on their own, as long as it furthers Donald Trump's agenda.
And we're seeing how he is kind of reaching outside of his jurisdiction as well, firing Lisa Cook, for example, people whose responsibility is supposed to be independent, or who is independent, coming up with some kind of random mortgage fraud argument to have her removed. This kind of undermines not just his role, but also the separation of departments such as the Treasury and Trump and the executive branch. This isn't going to stop, is it? I mean, he'll come up with more mortgage fraud style things. It's ironic he chose mortgage fraud, considering his own his history with buildings and overvaluing them. But I felt very sorry for Lisa Cook when this was announced.
Well, and it's since come out, Anthony, that at least 3 cabinet members in Trump's administration are potentially guilty of having done the same thing.
Yeah.
Is ProPublica just did research that they dropped a few days ago that shows that that those 3 cabinet members did something very similar to what Lisa Cook did. Well, look, by that logic, the Trump Justice Department needs to launch criminal investigations into them, because they have launched a criminal investigation into Lisa Cook for how she handled her mortgage paperwork. But I want to go back to what you just noted, which is these are allegations that were dredged up. They didn't come up in the normal course of investigations. That's what's so deeply, deeply alarming here. Is the timeline is that Donald Trump decided he wanted to take over the Federal Reserve. He considered ousting Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, as part of this takeover of the institution. He was apparently, at least temporarily, dissuaded from doing that because how much it would rock the markets. And so instead, he's opted for a different approach, which is, how about I stack the board of governors on the Federal Reserve with loyalists? And in order to do that, I need some open positions. So within weeks of him thinking about firing Jerome Powell, all of a sudden, conveniently, mortgage fraud allegations surface about Lisa Cook. That was not a coincidence.
The only black female on that bench as well.
That's right. I mean, My question is the classic investigative question. What did Donald Trump know and when did he know it? Because somebody was directed to go search for dirt on someone else on the on the Fed board to try to get them off the board. And that was apparently Lisa Cook that they were searching for damaging information on. This is not how government's supposed to work. This is indeed how authoritarian systems work. Now, I'm glad that there's been good government groups out there pointing out the hypocrisy of this, but make no mistake. I mean, this is a canary in the coal mine that this administration is willing to dig into anything. IRS records, mortgage records, you name it, to try to go find ways to punish its enemies. That's really, really scary stuff. And it's, if there's one exhortation that I have, Anthony, is I urge people to get in that fight. And I'll give a personal example. People are able to help out with these efforts, like with Lisa Cook. So in my case, after the president's executive order, there's a nonprofit group called Whistleblower Aid. There's a number of watchdog groups out there, and one of them, Whistleblower Aid, launched a legal defense fund for my case. And it's called endpresidentialrevenge.org. It's END presidentialrevenge.org. The only reason I have been able to fight back legally against Donald Trump's unconstitutional executive order against me is because there have been groups like that stood up those efforts. Now, that legal defense fund, we're also helping other people who are targets of presidential revenge. But I bring that up because most people who are in the crosshairs of the president don't have the resources to fight back. They cannot afford the lawyers. They cannot find the lawyers. We ourselves, my wife and I, the day that the executive order happened on April 9th, we talked about whether we would have to sell our house to pay for our defense. Okay. I mean, I have a young daughter who's, my wife's a stay-at-home mother. That's a big, big deal to stand there with your wife and say, we might have to sell our home and move into an apartment because this guy just added me to a blacklist. And
not
so
this guy, the president, Miles. I mean, that's what makes this even more insane, right?
That's right. And I don't love talking about it. I don't love, going out there and saying, no, I didn't have the resources to go afford the lawyers that I would need. But it's important to talk about because people need to know this is happening to dozens, hundreds, thousands of people who are on the receiving end of Trump's revenge, and they need that support as well. So, endpresidentialrevenge.org is one of the places. We're fortunate enough to have raised I think a sufficient war chest for our legal defense to go after the president. But there's a whole hell of a lot of people that we're trying to support who haven't yet and whose backs that we need to have. I'm glad to say in the case of Lisa Cook, we were able to get her incredible counsel. I didn't do it, but we share the same lawyer, Abby Lowell, who's a number one trial lawyer in America. And I'm glad that he took that case because that case could be one of the most important cases in this country, because if Donald Trump does take over the Fed board, you can kiss your savings goodbye, because we are bound to see the American economy tank. We are bound to see capital flight from this country, people who've invested in the United States pulling their money out because of fear of the dollar's stability. And we are very likely to see Donald Trump pump money from the Fed into the economy. What does that mean? It means it devalues your savings. So imagine a gigantic helicopter over the United States filled with cash. And if Donald Trump starts spraying that cash all across the country, that sounds good, right? Wow, money's coming from the sky. But if everyone grabs money from the sky, then everyone has more money to spend on goods, right? And then when that happens, the price of goods go up and the value of your savings goes down. One of the most dangerous and damaging things the president could do to this economy and to this country is to take over the Fed and to exert personal control over the Federal Reserve. And that's what he's trying to do. So, Lisa Cook's a great example of someone who we need to, at least rhetorically, be out there supporting in her fight against Trump.
We've seen him bully Jerome Powell on camera. And, I mean, it's excruciating to watch. Powell is pretty good at standing up to him. But this fight to push to get him to reduce interest rates, as you describe, he wants to do quantitative easing. He wants to print money effectively, this kind of age-old system that again, it's kind of a fake version of the economy that will temporarily give him a win. This flow of information I want to ask you about, because we saw this with the jobs numbers a few weeks ago. Trump didn't like the jobs numbers, so what did he do? He fired the statistician and replaced them with someone from the Heritage Foundation. This is going to be a big problem going forward. I mean, he's lying about how much investment is coming into the U.S., all of these. He says now almost $1 trillion worth of investment. None of that is true, maybe 5% at the very most. And so because he's shut down all of the traditional reporting methods, we're seeing this with the CDC, that now everything has to come through the White House. So Trump can lie about anything and everything, and public health, not to mention public finances, will be affected. How do you see this going? The fact that Americans can't rely on American statistics anymore, nor can markets, both domestically and around the world.
Anthony, I don't know if you've ever seen the film The Lives of Others. Have you seen that film? It's a fantastic German foreign language film.
Yeah.
I think it was 2006. It won Best Picture at the Oscars. Listeners who haven't seen that movie, I will tell you one of the best ways to understand what you are about to witness would be to go watch that film. That film takes place in East Germany, at the height of the Cold War, as the Stasi, the German secret police, are monitoring writers and artists. And it's about a writer who decides to push back and write something critical of the sitting regime. And I bring it up, Anthony, because in the film, the thing that the writer chooses to hone in on, the thing, his sort of protest article he writes, is about the Bureau of Statistics in East Germany, and how the incredible thing is that they track all of these numbers that make the regime look good. But there's a number that they don't track, and that number is suicides in the country. And this is based off of a number of true stories. The film is fictional, but that to me is very indicative of what we are seeing. Is that we're veering down the path of authoritarianism if the leader is worried about who controls the numbers and the statistics and what that says about the leader. And then he takes over those jobs and he installs loyalists in those jobs who will make the numbers lie. Now, numbers don't lie unless you make them lie. And that's what Donald Trump wants to do, because he doesn't want there to ever be a bad jobs report. I'm not sure we will ever see a bad jobs report ever again out of his administration, because he's going to make sure there's a statistician in there who will say what he wants to say. That in and of itself should be enough to tell us the direction that our country is headed. But I'll agree with you, Anthony. I mean, I think that all of this is bad for the American people and their futures. And if you're thinking about investing in the United States, I'm not surprised that people would be hesitant to invest more in this country. I'm not surprised that my friends in Europe don't want to travel here anymore. I wouldn't advise them to come to the United States right now. There's a lot of things that could go wrong for them if they come to the United States. And it starts from the moment they get here at the border. Is we have Customs and Border Protection and an immigration and customs enforcement now that is very focused on doing things to exact the president's revenge agenda rather than enforce the law. And that could be a really scary thing for people in a whole array of professions who might find themselves in the United States.
Let's look at the international perspective, and I want to tap into your experience with national security as well. This week, Trump took to his social media platform as the Chinese President Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin appeared together in Beijing for China's largest ever military parade. Trump accused Xi of conspiring against the United States as they attended the parade. I mean, he just wrote the weirdest post. You know, say hi to Vladimir and just weird stuff. And I mean, effectively, he has ceded power to Xi Jinping, hasn't he? I mean, we're seeing the world order shift. We're seeing America's might be diminished with Trump in charge, and this coalition of Xi Jinping, North Korea, Russia, potentially Iran, other nations as well, coming together as the superpower. Does Trump really realize? Does he understand any of this? Does he know that his ridiculous posts are actually taking us closer to a third world war?
I don't think he knows, but I will tell you that anyone who's a follower of international relations would have seen a seismic moment this past week when they looked at the photographs coming out of there, and especially to see India in the middle of it.
Right.
There has been a 20-year-long effort in the United States to try to shape a balance of power that favors America and favors the free world. And one of the bellwethers has been India. Will India side with the United States? Will India remain part of a broader, expanded Western alliance? And I think that question has now been answered, is we lost that. We squandered it in a very short period of time because Donald Trump drove that bellwether nation, that extraordinary country, into the arms of our adversaries. And you saw that in the photo op with Xi and Putin, you know, wrapping their arms around Modi and showing that this is their new pal. And that, to me, more than almost anything we've seen on the world stage, really sums up what has happened. Is Donald Trump has created a real realignment of the global political order that disfavors freedom and that disfavors the United States of America. Also a thing that was very foreseeable, Anthony. I mean, I've now spent the better part of 7 or 8 years warning that if Donald Trump came back to power, he would reshape the world order in a way that favors autocrats. John Bolton's been talking about it. A lot of folks who've worked under Donald Trump have talked about how, if given a second term, he would create a world that's much more favorable to our adversaries. And he's doing that. And we're seeing that play out in real time. And that has very real implications for all sorts of things that affect everyday Americans' lives. I mean, usually geopolitics feels so removed from the person in Ohio or Oregon who's watching the news. But that realignment that we are seeing, the driving of our friends into the arms of our adversaries, is going to be bad for the way Americans buy goods, sell goods, how they travel, where they travel, their physical safety, our safety as a country, and our children's future. Those things are dramatically impacted by that realignment. And, you know, whatever weird tweets Donald Trump sends out, I don't think they're going to be sufficient to turn that tide.
And let's just remind people what pissed India off. I mean, it was a combination of things, wasn't it? I mean, firstly, Trump trying to take credit for ending the war between India and Pakistan, which was ridiculous and entirely untrue. But secondly, imposing a 50% tariff on top of previous tariffs on India. I mean, he certainly doesn't understand international trade. But I also get the feeling that he didn't foresee the fact that people wouldn't want to travel to the US when people's phones are being seized at the airport and people are being treated like criminals before they've even set foot in the country. I mean, is anybody saying anything to him? Because from what I've seen, there are no adults or experts in the room at any of these meetings.
Well, you know, here's what happened in the first administration. There were people on both sides of that question. There were people who were intense nativists who wanted to literally close America's borders, not just to illegal immigration, but to legal immigration. And there were people who believed in the post-war order of free markets and free people that have made Americans the most prosperous and powerful nation in the history of the world. And the battle was usually won inside the administration by the latter group. So think the Steve Mnuchins of the world versus the Stephen Millers of the world in those debates. But now we have an administration that's now largely populated by those nativists who are more than happy to see tourism numbers go down in the United States, legal and illegal immigration go down in the United States. They don't mind that people are self-selecting out of this country and moving out. They want to raise the walls up. They want the United States to be more homogenous. And that's the vision that they're hoping for, is they're hoping for a much more protectionist country writ large, and they're going to get it. And, you know, I think Donald Trump at the end of the day is actually in his heart of hearts, not as amenable to that worldview, but the Oval Office is now a complete echo chamber. I mean, I think he could potentially be more open to a free trade style economy, because we saw him sometimes tip the balance in those debates, you know, to Mnuchin and others. But he's very impressionable. And, you know, now he's got folks that are only saying the one thing, and he's leaning into the protectionist version of himself, you know, full speed.
And easily manipulated. And we saw this when he arranged this ridiculous meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska.
Yeah.
Extremely costly, clearly served no purpose. The fly past, the whole red carpet treatment for a war criminal, and nothing has come of it. Even sanctions that Trump claimed he would impose upon Russia, the deadline of which has come and gone, and Trump has done nothing. Putin is benefiting hugely from all of this, isn't he? And is it that Trump is just simply on Putin's side? He wants to be on that podium with these dictators. That's where he sees himself. He doesn't care for the European allies. He sees them as kind of weak and not dictatorial enough. Is it as simple as that?
It is as simple as that. And
I was worried you were going to say that.
Yeah, Trump's national security team in the first term, I would say one of the top three things that we worried about is his ability to be fooled by foreign leaders through flattery. There was a very palpable fear anytime he took a phone call from a foreign leader, anytime he met with them, because there was this sense. I mean, look, foreign leaders knew this. They knew he was, it's obvious to anyone who watches television. The man is deeply susceptible to flattery. And so you can shape his worldview by flattering him. And, you know, Putin played him like a fiddle. He didn't even play him like a fiddle. I suspect a fiddle is kind of difficult to play. I mean, he probably, you know, he played him like a clarinet. You know, he's just got to plug his fingers over the holes and blow into the tube. And like, that's all Putin had to do to Trump in the lead up to and during this summit. And the fact that he, you know, planted things in Trump's brain again about mail-in voting that have now turned into, you know, potential executive orders and actions. I mean, it took nothing. It took the push of a finger on the first domino in a meeting with Putin for Trump to start going off on different paths and tangents that Putin wants him to go off on, because it'll be damaging to the United States. But I have to go back to Anthony. You know, you asked, you know, is it as simple as that? I will tell you how simple it is, because I think we forget sometimes. We wrap ourselves in the words of geopolitics and free market economics, and we wrap our, you know, selves in these discussions of history. It's not about any of that. It's about that the president of the United States is an observable idiot. He is very dumb. He is a very dumb, not well-read, intelligent man who can't synthesize thoughts, who can't track things across meetings, who can't remember things, who acts like a dementia patient when he goes to the microphone. He is an idiot. And we are getting the predictable results of that. We are getting a whiplash presidency that jumps all over the place, that puts the American people in danger. We are getting what we deserve by having put this man in office. And it's important every now and then for us to step back and acknowledge that. I mean, there's not three-dimensional chess that Donald Trump's playing. He's not playing any game. He is a stupid man who is not fit to be in the office that he's in, and he's in that office. And it's not surprising that a stupid man in that job makes very stupid decisions all the time. And those stupid decisions are not game board decisions. The pieces are American lives. And we are almost every week seeing new ways that American lives are in danger, from early in the administration when they're firing people who protect nuclear weapons, all the way up to the past few days when they're firing people at FEMA who are supposed to protect American lives. And why? Because the people at FEMA sounded the alarm about a potential catastrophe. They said, we're going to have another Katrina. We are in danger. And for warning that we are in danger, the administration wrapped duct tape over their mouths. You can't come up with something more ironic than that. And that is what you see in authoritarian regimes, is the people who sound the alarm and say, dear leader, we need to tell you the truth, we're in danger, are the people who get silenced. That's what's happening in this country, and it's because we've put an observable idiot back in the Oval Office.
And the media legitimize him because of respect for the office, that they kind of translate his idiocy into some kind of order. And that is very dangerous, isn't it? That he almost relies on the media that he refers to as the fake news to legitimize his ridiculousness.
Yeah, look, that needs to stop. And I've got to say, I rarely attack the press because the president does that sufficiently. I mean, the free press in this country is under assault. But some of the major networks, especially the ones that are backed by big corporate conglomerates, have been fallen asleep on the job by doing this sort of both sidesism. They so desperately want to be back in a different era of American politics that they are covering this man as if they didn't witness the first 4 years of it. And the place that I'm going to have a lot of heartburn with this is when something egregious happens, egregious enough to get some of those networks to wake up and they say, my God, who could have predicted Donald Trump would do this? I will say, you did, because you were covering it in the first term and you saw these things happen. You can't act surprised that they would happen this second time. And that's why, Anthony, I think it is actually very, very important that in this moment in our country, we have seen an explosion in new media, because legacy media is at the moment failing us. And it's failing us by burying its head in the sand and hoping that Donald Trump will somehow normalize. That's not going to happen. There isn't a day in the next 3.5 years, if that's all that Donald Trump serves, where he is going to start moderating and backpedaling and going a different direction. That's not going to happen. It's going to get worse. And we don't need those news organizations to just hate him to hate him. I don't need them to have emotive feelings about the man. They just need to cover it with the realism of a country that's sliding into autocracy. That's happening in the United States of America. It's very real, and it's the biggest fucking news story since any of those news organizations have ever existed. They should cover it that way.
On Thursday, you posted Trump is expected to sign an executive order that seeks to change the Department of Defense back to the Department of War. This presidential action is heavy with symbolism and meaning in the stupidest way possible. This focus on war fighters and Pete Hegseth, a kind of Fox News host, completely out of his depth in the Department of Defense. We saw a Venezuelan boat have a missile dropped on it the other day, killing 11 people in international waters. We don't know who those 11 people were. Trump claims that they were narcotics or gang members or something, very kind of loose description of who they might be. I mean, that in itself will be seen as a war crime from the international community. What do you think Venezuela thinks right now? Do they think they're at war, or that America is now at war with them?
Well, let me start with the first part, because I think it is actually interesting to focus on that symbolism of his renaming it the Department of War. And it's symbolic in all of the ways that he does not intend. And one of those, of course, is that we changed the name of the Department of War to the Department of Defense for a very important philosophical reason, which is that the United States doesn't believe in being in endless wars. It believes that force should only be used in our self-defense, right? And that's why in 1947, officially with the National Security Act, we changed the focus into the U.S. Department of Defense. So that's point number one. Point number two, a second irony, is that Donald Trump, of course, got elected on this mantra that he was going to end the forever wars and that he was the president of peace. So again, another irony for him to be attracted to Department of War. The third, of course, is that he is proclaiming to change this with an executive order. It requires an act of Congress to change that title. All of these three things combined, these three ironies, sort of unintentionally reveal Donald Trump's autocratic tendencies. He's trying to unilaterally change the name of a department whose name was supposed to reflect American values, and to beat his chest in a war-fighting posture in a way that contradicts his own campaign mantras. And I don't think he sees any of that irony. But Anthony, you point to the very real effects of this mentality, because it's not just about the name that's outside the building. It's about the mentality of the guy who wants to change something to the Department of War. And we are seeing Donald Trump enter into one of the phases I had predicted, which is misusing the United States military to do things that are against international law, to engage in things that are definitionally war crimes. And I believe we saw that this past week. There was a boat that left Venezuela in the Caribbean that allegedly had 11 drug smugglers on it. And the administration launched a missile strike and blew up that boat and incinerated all 11 people on board. Now, you don't need to have any sympathy for drug smugglers coming out of Venezuela who are trying to poison American streets with drugs. But you can hold two thoughts in your head at the same time, which is that we should go after those criminals, but we probably shouldn't murder them if we have the opportunity to arrest them. Why? Well, that's what we do in the United States, is you use appropriate force. So if there's a drug dealer down the block from you, well, you call the police on him, and maybe the police go arrest him. What the police don't do is surround his house, pour kerosene around the outside, light it on fire, and burn everyone inside alive. Why? Because that would be illegal. That would be overreach. That would be unlawful use of force. We saw that happen with this boat in Venezuela, and I will tell you very simply why it happened. Because this started in the first Trump administration, when he and his team wanted to be able to blow up boats of foreigners using the United States military. And what did we tell him? No, you cannot do that. It would be a violation of international law. You can't find a boat of unarmed people and just blow them out of the sky. But the president wanted that image. He wanted the optic of being able to just blow boats up to say, don't mess with me. And he's apparently gotten that. What's even more disturbing to me is I saw Marco Rubio, a man who used to believe in the rule of law, who's Secretary of State, tout this legal strike on social media, even though clearly he as well knew that this was not a lawful strike. I've not seen any reporting that anyone on this boat was armed. I've not seen any reporting that the people on the boat represented a threat to U.S. forces, represented a threat to the United States, or represented a threat to any civilians. Certainly the drugs would have. But Anthony, let me tell you, having overseen dozens of these operations, what you would normally do in this circumstance, if you had intelligence that a boat with 11 people was carrying drugs, you know what you do? You go intercept the boat. It's really, really simple.
Apprehend,
There are U.S. forces in the region to go intercept the boat. They would shoot out the engine. They'd board the boat. They'd arrest everyone. And I'm going to tell you why that's better than blowing up the boat. Because you then get to interrogate those 11 people. You get more leads. You track down where the drugs came from, and you are more likely for the long term to shut down that drug operation. Instead of giving a would-be dictator a grainy black and white image of a boat on fire, you can actually do something about the problem. So it's not just that this is illegal, and it's not just that this sets a really bad precedent. It actually doesn't solve the problem. It makes the problem worse.
Finally, Miles, the theme for a lot of the things that we have been talking, it seems, if you think critically about Trump and his policies, is a kind of white supremacy. And we're seeing this with the abduction of people of color from the streets of America, with this increased ICE army, which is about to get $170 billion investment. It's going to be a force that has a bigger budget than most countries' militaries together. How does this end? Because a lot of people are worried about it being Trump's secret police. They're going to eventually be policing polling places when it comes to elections, and that the police state will be the result of a lot of these policies. Is that where this is headed, or do you have a kind of different picture of the future?
That's where it's headed. And anyone who tells you otherwise is not reading the tea leaves. Donald Trump will have multiple bureaucratic entities that could be considered his own secret police. That sounds really outlandish. It's now the reality, because all that really means is, does he have the ability unilaterally to direct different law enforcement agencies to go engage in punitive action, investigative action, or arrests at will, and by his own whims? And normally you would say a president doesn't have that, because there'd be layers of checks and balances and approvals and lawyers. That won't be the case anymore, if not already, with the FBI and with ICE, which will become the largest law enforcement agency, has become the largest law enforcement agency in the United States of America. These will effectively be able to serve as secret police for the president. Now, the extent to which they are really just depends on how much he's going to try to be using them for his own personal purposes. That's really what determines it. And that's pretty scary that that's the only thing keeping us between a normal law enforcement organization and the Stasi in East Germany. So that's, I think, immensely disturbing, as it should be for people. But I want to go back to the start of your question where you mentioned sort of white supremacy. When I went into the first Trump administration, I didn't buy into the criticisms that Donald Trump was a bigot. Now, I didn't know the man, but I had to think to myself, he may be expressing xenophobic policies, but I bet the real guy is not an actual bigot. I mean, that can't be, right? And I wasn't trying to give him the benefit of the doubt on a lot of things, but I thought, people on the left throw around the term racism a lot. I bet Donald Trump's not an actual racist. And then I sat in the Oval Office when he talked about immigration. And I can remember him talking about the countries that he wanted to dial immigration down close to zero or at zero, and the countries where he wanted to dial it up. And when he would talk about the countries he wanted to dial down, he would talk about the Haitis and the Somalias and the Ethiopias and the Afghanistans. You get the picture. And the countries where he wanted to dial up immigration, you would hear him talk about the Denmarks and the Finlands and the Icelands and the Norway and the Swedens.
Well, we saw the white South African farmers recently being given American flags as they arrived into
it became pretty obvious in those conversations. Oh, okay, I get it. He doesn't want poor colored people to come into the country, doesn't want poor brown people, doesn't want poor black people, doesn't want people of color coming in from these places. And he would like white, blonde-haired people to come into the country. I'm not making this shit up. Donald Trump has said this stuff himself now. But after meetings like that, where we would toggle from one to the other, I thought, okay, this guy does have deeply racist tendencies and a deeply racist worldview. And that has manifested into his policy. That is affecting real people's lives. But it goes beyond immigration. And I think that's important for folks to realize, because there are some people, reasonable people, who say, look, I don't like Donald Trump, but I really would like to see illegal immigration end in this country. And maybe they want lawful immigration, but they want illegal immigration to end. Well, to those people, I say this: the apparatus that he is using to crack down on illegal immigration, he can and will use to come after you and your communities. And if that sounds dramatic to you, I just want you to turn on the news as he sends troops and U.S. forces into Chicago, as he sends them into Baltimore, because all of them are not going to be United States military. A lot of them are going to be ICE officers, and their sole mission is not going to be immigration enforcement. Because guess what? People who don't understand DHS don't know that ICE doesn't just enforce immigration policy. They can investigate a vast array of crimes. They investigate cyber crimes. They investigate financial crimes. They do all sorts of work beyond just illegal immigration. So this largest law enforcement agency in the United States, that's now basically directly accountable to the president and the president only, has the ability to come investigate you, Americans, and will come to your city, and you will see these agents doing things beyond just arresting and deporting illegal immigrants. That's why we do need to be worried about, turning ICE into this super organization.
It's hard, isn't it, for us to kind of find an optimistic note here. But I think the message that I'm getting from you, and it's certainly one that I try to push too, is that people need to wake up, and this is not a drill. And that, we look at history, and you've, referenced the Stasi and Nazi Germany several times, and that it can happen here.
It can happen here. It is happening here. And I will give you one note of optimism, which is this. I say a lot to folks that I consider myself an optimistic fatalist. And what do I mean by that? Well, the fatalism is my belief that nature destroys everything it creates. It does. It will destroy Anthony and Miles and this republic and Earth. Nature does that. It's inevitable. But nature also creates everything it creates is from something it has destroyed. Okay, why am I waxing philosophical like that? Because it wasn't that long ago that our founders, who aren't terribly different from anyone listening or from me or Anthony, they were flesh and blood people who'd read a certain set of books and took on some radical opinions. It wasn't that long ago that they decided they needed to do something quite radical and go create a new country. Now, I'm not saying right now we all need to secede from the United States, but what I am saying is we are in a moment where we need non-traditional thinking, because there may come a day where things are looking so bad in the United States that we want to avoid violence, that we want to avoid the total devolution into an autocracy. And we may need to consider how to reconstitute our republic. And I hope that that just means at some point in our future, a new constitutional convention, where as Americans, we're coming back together and saying, hey, we need to renegotiate the civic compact because things got really, really bad. But it may not be that. But there needs to be real conversations about how to avoid that slide, because Americans, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents, don't want to live in a despotism. So we need to think about how to get out of that. And the traditional Washington press release put out the talking points in the tweet, that's not going to save us from a despotism. So, but look, the optimism there is it's in our control. We have the ability to do that. And if it gets really bad, no, the answer is not just we get thrown into a second civil war. There are a lot of off-ramps. History shows us there are a lot of off-ramps, and we have the ability to create something new or to resuscitate our republic on the back end of this.
Okay, we have to finish, but for now, Miles Taylor, thanks for joining The Weekend Show.
Thanks, Anthony.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News or by joining the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. And I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.